Well, everyone, let's go ahead and take a look at the Blackberry Classic and see how it holds up in 2022. Now, here's the thing about this phone. I never really got into Blackberry phones. I think, iPhone was kind of like the time frame I started growing up, but I knew a lot of people who used Blackberries and they lived by them and they died by them. I think one of my favorite Blackberries ever was the Blackberry Priv, and it's funny because nobody really even remembers that phone, but that easily is not only one of my favorite Blackberries, but one of my favorite concepts of a device. I kind of like the keyboard screen type of dynamic. Unfortunately, Blackberry, I think recently up until like last month or a couple of weeks ago, actually like completely stopped, developing phones or something. This was, kind of a long time coming. They mentioned a couple years ago they're ceasing production and now they're actually fully done, or like Blackberry Mobile's completely done, something like that. Now with the Blackberry Classic, this phone came out in 2014, and what's very interesting is that it's not really like a super outdated feeling phone or ugly phone, I think, but the internals, like, it makes absolutely no sense to purchase a phone like the Blackberry Classic right now. For one, it's kind of outdated when you look at the design and you look at the latest phones, but two, the company that made this phone isn't even coming around anymore, so it doesn't even make any sense to buy it there because it's not getting supported. There's not really too many people who own this phone anymore, and when you look at the price tag of this phone, it just makes more sense to buy something like the Pixel 4a that's like $200 something now, even cheaper than that, than buying something like a Blackberry Classic. So I'll go and leave some of those phones linked in the description. You can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the front of this specific device, we had a 3.5-inch IPS panel, and it was a square panel, so 720 by 720 HD resolution, which is super cool, and it wasn't really that bad of a panel. I actually do think it was pretty decent. That square resolution, however, is kind of interesting because for some games that were made for, any device out there, they aren't really suited for 720 by 720. Usually it's like 1080p, 720p, the standard resolution, more so like a rectangle. So a lot of some apps and some games that you would play for some, like the Blackberry Classic, it wouldn't really work out that well. So that was one thing I wanted to say. The Blackberry Passport also had this issue. There was another device that had this issue as well. That's why the Blackberry Priv, I think, was a really good phone, because it wasn't trying to be this like weird type of device. Now you also have the keyboard on the front, which was really cool. It was, the standard keyboard. You could write on it, you could type on it. Really cool. I kind of liked it. It had a good click to it, but the problem with something like the keyboards on here is that as you get older and older, sometimes your hands get bigger and bigger. My hands ended up getting fatter and my thumbs were so fat that I can't even click on the keyboard's keys to, the same. So that's kind of an issue. You don't want it to just have, you don't want it to not be able to adapt to you. But also I look at my iPhone keyboard and that's been the same. But it seems like the swipe keyboard and different things like that I love a lot more. This keyboard doesn't have that capability, so that's kind of a disadvantage. But you also had that middle bar right there, which allowed you to easily call people, end calls, the Blackberry mobile icon, the back button too, and that middle button, which was pretty much just kind of could be used as a trackpad too, which is really cool. But it was also a touchscreen, so you didn't really have to even interact with those buttons too much because it was a touchscreen overall. Now you had the micro USB port on the bottom, micro SD card slot as well. And on the back, you had a very cool looking back. It looked pretty cool to me, at least. It was still plastic, but it still felt really good, and I didn't really have too many issues with it. Now, we do have the camera setup on this phone, which was really interesting. We had a single 8 megapixel camera on the back, and you had a 2 megapixel camera on the front. Now, in 2022, this phone being almost 8 years old, it is not that good of a camera anymore, which is kind of a given. But any phone from 2014 isn't really going to be that great. The main time, you have to keep this in mind. The Blackberry Classic came out around the same time as the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus, and those cameras aren't really that good anymore either. But that's probably another big reason why this phone isn't really worth it in that sense. But it's still kind of interesting of what this phone had at the time. And again, I think it's totally okay. You can still take photos on it, you can still take videos on it. But again, would you want to? The quality really isn't that great, and I think when it comes down to it, it just doesn't really make too much sense to buy a phone like this when the camera's already outdated and the software's outdated and the phone company that made this phone isn't even pretty much here anymore. So the camera, I guess, I would give it like a 5 out of 10, for how old it is and everything, but I personally wouldn't want to use this camera anymore. So in terms of that covers it up there. Now in terms of the software, this thing came out with Blackberry OS 10.3.1. I guess you could get 10.3.2 on it. And again, I mean, when it comes down to that, there's really not too much else going for it. You know, it was pretty much outdated a couple of years ago and it's still pretty much outdated. So nothing has changed there. And that's why it's so important with software, because, you know, when you want to get a phone, you don't want to get a phone that's already outdated. And that's pretty much what's going on with this specific device. So it makes so much more sense to buy something like, you know, a Pixel or one of the later Samsungs. That would make way more sense than anything else in my opinion. So in terms of that covers it up there. Now in terms of the performance, this thing had that Qualcomm Snapdragon S4 Plus chipset, Adreno 225 GPU, and 2GB of RAM. There was only one model of this phone, but it did have, you know, a microSD card slot, which was perfectly fine. Now again, when it comes down to the performance of this device, I honestly, you know, I didn't use this phone when it first came out. I'm only using it now, but I do remember a lot of people being somewhat happy with the performance of this device. I think people more so bought this phone mostly because of the novelty of the keyboard. I think that was a big thing that people liked about it, and I'm sure a lot of people liked, you know, BlackBerry Mobile at that point. But the thing with the BlackBerry Classic is that I just don't think the performance is that great anymore, you know? I don't think it's actually that bad, which is pretty interesting. But compared to all of the newest phones that have came out, it pretty much makes absolutely no sense to buy something like this because it is already outdated. So that is kind of the issue. When you're getting something like the BlackBerry Classic, it's an outdated phone, it doesn't really have too much going for it, and the performance really isn't that great either. Another big thing is that because of that resolution of that display, it kind of throws a lot of applications off, and they don't really look as great as they probably should. So that is another disadvantage with this type of device. I don't think it's a deal breaker, but it is something to keep in mind. I already wasn't interested in this phone because of the, you know, outdatedness of it, but when you add in like the performance not being that great anymore compared to the latest phones, the lack of 120 Hz and all these things that we have nowadays, it is a pretty outdated device when it comes down to it right now. It doesn't mean it was a bad phone when it first came out, but it's not really a phone I'd recommend buying as of right now. So in terms of that covers it up there. And ultimately when it comes down to it, it's quite obvious. I don't think the BlackBerry Classic is worth it in 2022. It doesn't really make any sense to purchase this phone, especially, and I said this last year, but especially because BlackBerry is pretty much going out of business and they're not really going to be making these types of phones anymore. It just doesn't make any sense to purchase this phone. However, what phones should you purchase instead of this? Well, I think honestly, the Pixel devices are great. If you have the money, go for the Pixel 6 or 6 Pro. Those are definitely going to be the better options for you. Something like the Samsung Galaxy S10 is also a really good option because it's still supported with software. There's not really too many phones out there that still support keyboards that are still supported with software. So everything has pretty much moved away from this. So that's a big thing to keep in mind. You don't want to get a phone that's already outdated at launch when you buy it. And this phone is pretty much that, which is unfortunate, but it is what it is. You know, there's not much we can do about it right now. So in that sense, it would make more sense to buy something like the Google Pixel 5a, the Pixel 4a, the Samsung Galaxy S10s. If you have the money, go for the Pixel 6, the Pixel 6 Pros. Those are going to be the, you know, best all-around, you know, phones, devices you can pick up, but I probably would stay away from the BlackBerry Classic. It's kind of sad because, you know, they brought a lot to that table. They were very, very popular, but they just didn't adapt as fast, and that was kind of the issue with them. So in terms of that covers it up there. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that'll mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.